Chapter 12, Part 2. Minilik and Aitu gird for battle. It is unclear whether the Ethiopians were waiting for the Italians, though the preponderance of evidence suggests they were not. By the time Rodolfo Mozziconi wrote his account of the battle in the 1930s, he could claim with confidence that Minilik was with Aitu in church when he received word of the Italian advance. According to an unnamed Ethiopian eyewitness, a messenger found the royal couple already deep in prayer at 4 in the morning. The messenger approached Minilik, who listened as the messenger whispered dramatic news. The Italian forces were on their way. Then, in a stunning gesture of piety, the emperor turned his attention back to the service. Only when the service had concluded did Minilik allow himself to prepare for battle. Horns sounded and commanders were all alerted, and by 5:30 the entire Ethiopian army was ready for battle. The story works well for both sides. Minilik and Aitu come off as suitably pious in church before dawn, while the Italian defeat becomes a bit easier to understand. They weren't done in by jealousy and ambition, but were betrayed by spies. They were defeated because the Ethiopians had had hours to prepare. However, there are good reasons to doubt this anonymous account, the best of them being that the official Ethiopian chronicle of the reign of Minilik, which misses no opportunity to cast the monarchs in a favorable light, makes no mention of it. Nor does Joseph Nuguse mention it in his detailed account set down shortly after the battle in a letter to Alfred Ilg. Nuguse marks the beginning of the battle as gunfire exchanged with Turito's men, at which point Minilik the lion, girded with an iron belt, arrayed his whole army and came out. The Ethiopian Chronicle does point out that the clergy of Aksum were at Adwa with the royal couple on March 1st. They had arrived the day before, most likely to protest the repeated demands for grain at that Minilik's army had made upon them and their city, in violation of a long-standing municipal privilege exempting the holy city of Aksum from such exactions. They were still at Adwa when the battle began, a providential sign, and they carried the altar tabot of Mary, Mother of Jesus, into battle in support of the army and the royal couple. It was said that Minilik never went on campaign without the tabot of St. George, whose feast day happens to be March 1st. The chance presence of the clergy of Aksum and of the tabots of both Mary and St. George would later be used to support the claim that God intervened on the side of Ethiopia. Turito needed no sacred signs to know that he was in serious trouble. He was on high ground, but he was at least a mile and a half ahead of Albertone and any supporting forces. As gunfire ricocheted among the hills, the entire Ethiopian army awoke to the sounds of combat. Turito had stumbled upon Ras Mangesha's forces, but Empress Aitu had 5,000 men, commanded by Balcha, in the immediate vicinity, and they were quickly engaged. Tekle Haimanot, king of Gojam, had 4,000 to 5,000 men, a short jog away. Ras Wele, Aitu's brother, had another 10,000 nearby. Minilik's 35,000 were encamped in the broad, sweeping valley that extended from the town of Adwa out to Abba Garima and north onto the slopes of Shaloda. When a mouse wants to die, it goes and smells a cat's tail. It was thus that Ghebreyesus, the Ethiopian diplomat, described the utter disproportion of forces engaged. Nearly 10,000 Ethiopian fighters immediately converged on the 950 men in Turito's 1st Native Battalion. Within minutes, Turito's battalion was pinned down and facing encirclement. When an advance guard is actively seeking an enemy in order to engage in battle, its role is clear. It pins the enemy in place, hunkers down, and waits to be reinforced by the army's main body. Alternatively, the advance guard serves to protect the main force from surprise. It is if it engages the enemy, it withdraws to the main force. Neither scenario, however, fit Turito's situation. Goaded by Albertone's mockery or by his own high spirits, Turito had allowed his men to get far ahead of the rest of Albertone's column and had lost communication with it. All the same, Turito's situation was soon clear enough to Albertone. Albertone and his men had heard lively gunfire shortly after 6 and could tell that Turito's forces were seriously engaged. However, Albertone could not move forward to join Turito without putting his soldiers seriously at risk. The distance was just too great. Nor could Turito and his men easily scamper back to Albertone. Albertone's forces were not yet in position, and to withdraw would risk drawing the Ethiopian forces upon Albertone's column before it could deploy. An army on the move is vulnerable, especially when it depends on its artillery, and artillery pieces are disassembled for the march. Normal fueled cannon in this period might be unlimbered and ready for action in little more than a minute. Mountain batteries were different. The cannon had to be taken down from the mules and assembled before they could be deployed. Until Albertone's artillery and infantry were arrayed and able to offer a covering fire, Turito was on his own. While Turito's forces were scrambling to hold on, the main portion of Albertone's column was arriving on a hillside called Adiveci, more than a mile behind. This high ground offered a number of advantages. It was about 300 feet wide, leaving plenty of room for Albertone's battalions to take up their position. In front of them was a valley, nearly a mile wide and long, across which attacking Ethiopian forces would have to travel in order to close with the Italians. Ethiopians moving against Albertone would be exposed to rifle and artillery fire with little cover. Albertone had chosen well, as the Ethiopians were soon to discover. However, the position was framed by 2 mountains. If those were taken, the Italian position would become untenable, forcing a withdrawal. Albertone was convinced of the security of his position, believing the mountains on his right and left to be too high and steep for the Ethiopians to occupy. In his judgment, he would be proven wrong. Albertone set to work positioning his forces, including his 3 remaining Askari battalions. He ordered Major Rodolfo Valli's 7th Native Battalion, with more than 900 infantrymen to the left, sidling up to the steep hillside. Beyond them, a group of Eritrean irregulars covered their flank. Major Salvatore Cosiu's 6th Native Battalion, with 850 rifles, took up position on the right, holding the southern flank of Mount Gososa. Major Giovanni Camera's 8th Native would hold the center. Menelik ordered soldiers into position opposite Albertone. The Ethiopians occupied a saddle between 2 large hills. The hills protected their flanks, and the saddle itself provided a natural platform for the Ethiopian artillery. Morning had broken, and Menelik could clearly see Albertone's forces arrayed in front of him. This was the fight that Menelik had wanted, army against army in the open field. If Italian training, discipline, and technology could overwhelm Ethiopian numbers, then so be it. although no one knew it at the time, this was a battle for more than Ethiopia. It was a fight for the future of Africa. There was a profound visual irony on the makeup of the forces, for the soldiers on both sides were African, apart from a few dozen European officers, as many artillerymen, maybe 100 in all. Most of Almost to a man, Albertoni's brigade was composed of Askari recruits, that is, Africans. His main force consisted of 4 native battalions of just under 1,000 African soldiers each. Add to these nearly 400 Eritrean irregulars. Thus, of the 4,076 soldiers squaring off against Menelik, perhaps 100 were white. The opening shots in the Battle for Africa would be fired by Africans on both sides. The difference, of course, was that on Menelik's side, the soldiers were led by men who looked like themselves, Africans leading Africans. In Albertoni's brigade, one could glimpse a different future, Africans under command of Europeans. Albertoni's mountain batteries trailed his infantry battalions. At 6:30, they were ordered to take up positions at the center of the Italian line. Artillerymen hauled the guns off the backs of their mules. While some men began to assemble the guns, others drove the mules up the slope behind them, and still others cleared away brush that would encumber the field of fire. Ethiopian forces were already making their way across the valley. Italian rifle fire held them at bay. As the shattered remnants of Torito's battalion attempted to scamper back, Captain Henry's 1st Mountain Battery was the first to open fire. It was 7:15. At first, the Ethiopian forces attacked the Italian center. Ethiopian riflemen, including Menelik's Imperial Guard, descended into the valley with the glare of the morning sun in their eyes. They started first in smaller numbers and then in concentrated masses, making easy targets for Italian rifle fire and shell. Eventually, all 14 guns in the 4 Italian artillery batteries were ready. They opened fire at a range of 5,000 feet. The first Ethiopian attacks were repulsed, but each time the Ethiopian infantry faltered, another charge would follow. Empress Taitu shouted praise and encouragement. In an unusual gesture, she approached her soldiers on foot and pulled aside her veil to speak. As an Ethiopian chronicler put it, she abandoned her womanly nature and acted like a warrior seasoned by combat. An unveiled empress going out on foot shocked and motivated the soldiers as much as her words. What's going on? Courage, victory is ours. Other women joined Taitu. With their manly virtue at stake, the soldiers dared not show fear or hesitation. From the Italian side, the artillery continued their slow, measured rate of fire. The fire was effective, but the repeated infantry assaults forced them to reduce their range as the Ethiopian forces pushed closer, finding cover from which to harass the Italian positions. In 3 successive advances, the Ethiopians were relentless. As costly as these advances were to the Ethiopians, the arithmetic was unassailable. As long as the Ethiopians could continue to feed men into the attack, they would eventually close with the Italian forces. Meanwhile, other components of the Ethiopian attack were coming together. The Ethiopian rapid-fire Hotchkiss artillery battery, which had already proven its effectiveness in the siege at Mekelle, was firing on Albertoni's forces from the saddle between the mountains. The emperor himself appeared to inspire and encourage the artillerymen. Taitu presided over the operation of 5 artillery pieces. Then, as Ethiopian artillery found its range as methodically as it had at Mekelle, Ras Makonnen and Ras Mikael prepared to order 15,000 soldiers against Albertoni's right. At roughly the same time, Takla Haymanot Wagushum Gangul, the ruler of Lasta province, and Empress Aitu directed forces in a sweeping arc against the Italian left. The classic Ethiopian strategy of envelopment was taking shape. It forced the Italians to scatter their fire across a wider arc, reducing its effect and providing some relief for Ethiopian forces advancing against the center. Improvisation. Back at the passes, Dabromida's brigade had reached its rendezvous point, the pass between Ishasho and Rayo. At 5:15 in the morning, soon they heard the unmistakable sound of gunfire down in the lowlands 5 miles to the west. As Turito stumbled into the Ethiopian camp, Alberto walked, an infantry captain in General Dabromida's brigade, recalled that he and his soldiers reacted to the first sounds of combat with a mixture of disbelief and dread. Some of us received the first sounds of gunfire that morning with incredulous chuckles, others with a moral effect that was clearly visible. Despite talk of an attack at the troops left at Soria, many in Dabromida's brigade had not expected their night-long march to end with a fight. Around 6:30, Oreste Baratieri arrived at the northern pass. What he heard and saw would have made his heart sink. Logistics are the heart and soul of a fighting force. An army that articulates clumsily is an army at risk. But instead of seeing his forces quietly consolidating their positions at the pass, as his plan intended, Baratieri was confronted with a situation that threatened his entire army. For 30 minutes already, the cackle of gunfire had ricocheted up from the valley below with building intensity. Baratieri and his staff moved up the flank of Ishasho, accompanied by General Dabromida, for a better view of the combat below. The sun was up by then and at his back, but the peaks at the pass were still casting deep shadows into the valleys. From Ishasho, they could barely make out Albertone's position, partly obscuring by the sloping terrain, but they could clearly see the developing Ethiopian attack on the facing high ground. Albertone was nearly 4 miles ahead of the rest of the army, well to the west of the passes. His forces were sharply engaged. He would need help to extricate himself. Baratieri commanded Dabromida to descend from the pass and take up a position slightly behind Albertone and to his right, forward from the pass on the road to Mariam Shavitu. Such a position would provide support for Albertone's brigade and offer cover for a retreat. At the same time, Baratieri sent orders to General Arimondi, moving up from Gundapta to occupy the passes. What happened next is one of the great mysteries of the Battle of Adwa. What Baratieri intended seemed clear enough. Dabromida should link up with Albertone and provide meaningful support by establishing a position to the right of and behind Albertone. Such a position, in Equan relative to Albertone, would both support Albertone's right and cover his retreat. When Dabromida set out, his route took him west on the main road toward Adwa. If nothing else, the sound of rifle and artillery fire ought to have oriented him. However, a few miles west of the pass, the road splits, and instead of going left toward Albertone's forces, Dabromida turned to the right. Vittorio Emanuele Dabromida was a scholar of military science. He was also, like most high-ranking officers in the Italian army, a member of the Italian gentry. His lofty, distant air made him unapproachable, the antithesis of a soldier's soldier. His role was to lead, theirs was to follow. He expected to be obeyed. As Dabromida led his soldiers away from Albertone's brigade, they had no idea where they were going, and they dared not ask. Mariam Shavitu is the name Baratieri attached to the route he wanted Dabromida to take. It is the name of a long, narrow valley significantly to the north, more than 1.5 miles, of the position occupied by Albertone, an obvious neglect of Baratieri's tactical intent. Though perhaps in dogged obedience to Baratieri's toponymy. Dobromida took himself and his men to a position not merely on the road to Mariam Shavitu, but actually into the valley of Mariam Shavitu. It was a position where Dobromida and his men could be of little use to Albertone, except perhaps as a diversion, drawing Menelik's forces away from Albertone. Reinforcements would be welcome. Baratieri had ordered his generals to remain in contact with one another and with him after leaving Saria. Albertone ignored the order. Finally, at 9 in the morning on March 1st, a full 12 hours after leaving Saria, Baratieri received his first message from Albertone. At Kidane Meret Pass, the 1st Battalion remains seriously engaged. I have all remaining troops in position behind them. I seek to disengage the 1st Battalion. Large enemy force behind me. Reinforcements would be welcome. 1396, 815. Major General Albertone. The message is stunning for what it doesn't say. In reading it, one could be forgiven for thinking that only Torito's 1st Native Battalion was involved in the fight, that when, in fact, by 8:15 Torito's battalion had been destroyed, and Torito along with it. A few minutes later, Baratieri received another bulletin from Albertone, in fact sent earlier than the first at 7:30. It suggested a somewhat more urgent situation. It opened with a bold lie. Kitana Meret Pass was occupied without the enemy's knowledge at 6 a.m. The enemy is all around Adwa and behind Mariam Shabitu. The 1st Battalion pushed beyond the pass and is energetically engaged. The 6th Battalion occupies a strong high ground on the right. The other 2 battalions are grouped with the artillery. I can foresee a serious engagement. Move up the Armodi Brigade and reinforcement. It would be quite opportune to move up the Dobromida Brigade, which would draw itself a part of the enemy's forces. This bulletin probably best describes how General Albertone hoped the events of March 1st would unfold. Albertone would engage the Ethiopian forces and draw the reluctant Baratieri into a decisive confrontation with Menelik. With Albertone pinned, Baratieri would have no choice but to move the rest of his forces forward. The decisive battle with Menelik would ensue. The very tone of the message suggests that Albertone had assumed command and issued orders to Baratieri. Move up the Arimondi Brigade, wresting control of the battle from his superior. This was Albertone's showdown scenario. The problem was that Albertone's very advanced position made it almost impossible to bring about. Albertone's position was now analogous to that of his own advance guard, Torito's 1st Battalion. Just as Albertone could not risk moving his forces forward to support Torito directly, Baratieri could not chance sending his men forward in support of Albertone. And since Albertone could not disengage and rejoin the main Italian body, the stage was set for the piecemeal destruction of the Italian army. Menelik shoots the gap. Albertone had only the vaguest idea of what was going on with the rest of the Italian forces behind him. He had been so reckless in his advance and so dilatory in his communications. He could only hope the battle was about to be transformed by the imminent arrival of reinforcements. The Dobromida Brigade could cover, and the outlook was not good. Whatever the source of his error, confusion, or willfulness, Dobromida led his brigade away on a path that showed his movement significantly. The path they followed over a pass and then down into a valley was so narrow in parts that Dobromida's men could march only in a single file. Crates became wedged against trailside boulders and dense brush snagged packs, stopping mules on their tracks. Mules had to be unloaded to clear obstacles, then reloaded beyond. Delays affected morale too. The painfully slow movement of Dobromida's forces clashed with a deep sense of urgency that came from knowing that Albertone's brigade of 4,000 was bearing the full fury of the Ethiopian army. Men were showing signs of fatigue and extreme thirst. Before Menelik's soldiers abandoned advanced positions for Adwa, they had fouled the water around their camps at Yeha and Gundapta by leaving animal carcasses in streams and ponds. Italian officers had forbidden soldiers to take water without permission. But Damarmida's soldiers, thirsty and unsure when they would find water again, filled their canteens from sources that were almost certainly polluted. Finally, by a circuitous, slow, and difficult route, Dabramida arrived in position a full hour and a quarter after receiving his own orders. He then dispatched a bulletin to Baratieri.
Hour 9:15. Extensive Ethiopian encampment observed to the north of Adwa. A strong column heads from this encampment toward Albertone's position. I am reaching out to Albertone and am also holding a strong nucleus of troops amassed near the road that leads from the pass to Adwa, and I'm also keeping watch on the heights to my right.
Translation. First, Dabramida had completed his movement and now had his men in position. Second, he was seeking contact with Albertone while facing a major Ethiopian force directly in front of him. He does not report that he had actually communicated with Albertone. Since his orders were to support Albertone's right and, if necessary, provide cover for Albertone's retreat, his mission already was compromised. Menelik wasted no time exploiting the Italian mistake. The sheer sluggishness of Dabramida's advance stole any possibility of surprise. Not that it mattered. The Ethiopians watched Dabramida's column take up positions in the Miriam Shavitu Valley without linking to Albertone's forces. Seeing the strategic opening, Menelik ignored Dabramida's challenge and directed a column of 15,000 Ethiopian infantrymen into the gap between Albertone and Dabramida. This was a strong column, Dabramida mentioned in his report to Baratieri at 9:15. The column consisted of troops under the command of Makonnen and Mangasha. By 9:30, part of his column was engaging Albertone's right flank, while another part began to push beyond, effectively dividing the Italian army into three now hopelessly isolated pieces. Albertone facing off against Menelik and Daitu, Dabramida at Mariam Shavitu, and the remainder of the Italian army at the passes. Although the combat would continue into the afternoon and sporadic fighting would go on until well after dark, by 9:30 in the morning the Battle of Adwa was effectively over.